Many people think of mastering as this sort of ritual, where they have a cascade of effects that must be used every time because it worked the last time. So they go, I always use a stereo imager to make my tracks wider, or I always use this saturation plugin and that multiband compressor, things like that. Let me say that this is not the best way to go about it. Mastering is about checking your tune one last time against the reference tracks in a reliable listening situation, optimizing the sound if needed. So yeah, if your mix was quiet, now you can make it louder. If it wasn't bright enough, you can make it brighter. But your mix could be bright enough, and if that's the case, well then making it even brighter might ruin it. The strings might become very harsh, for example. Here's a process that you can follow step by step, just like you did with the mixing plan. Think of this process as a simple checklist. For each step, you're going to pay attention to one specific aspect of the sound and make changes only if appropriate. Then tick the box and move on. Every time you apply new processing, you can try switching the new plugin on and off to see if it's actually helping you get closer to the desired tone or not. Start with one limiter and place it towards the end of your chain. Leave 2 free slots after it. This will be your main limiter. Set the ceiling to -0.3 dB for music releases. For social media content, set it to -1 dB. More on this later. Place yourself at the busiest section of the tune. We use that to gauge the loudness and many other things, although we obviously have to check the whole track. Now bring up the volume of your track by lowering the limiter's threshold. Try to get close in volume to your references, but stop as soon as the limiter starts doing any obvious gain reduction. If you can see that the limiter is doing some gain reduction, that's okay. If you can hear the limiter pumping horribly, that's not okay. So just bring the volume to a decent level without pushing it too hard. And that will be your starting point. For quiet music that doesn't have a lot of percussion, stuff like just piano and strings for example, you might not see any gain reduction at this stage, and that's perfectly normal. Time to do some corrective EQ. Open one EQ at the beginning of your chain and smooth out any problematic resonances with targeted narrow bell EQ. How do you identify such nasty resonances, you might ask? They can be anywhere. With orchestral music, you can easily find resonances around 30, 60, 80 or 100 Hz. The low strings and the low percussion can be responsible for that. You can find resonances between 100 and 300 Hz, which might be caused by the reverb. You can find a build-up of lower mids, caused by the violas, bassoons, clarinets and low brass. That might require a slightly wider scoop. You could find a lot of energy around 6K. The strings, particularly the high strings, are usually responsible for that. These are just examples. Compare your music with the reference tracks, and maybe also analyze both your music and the references with a spectrum analyzer. Remember that now you're no longer EQing an instrument or a group. You're working on the track as a whole. Small changes can make a big difference, so start with a conservative approach. Sometimes -0.2 to -0.5 dB with a targeted bell EQ in a few spots is all you need to improve the overall clarity of a track. Sometimes you need to carve out a bit more. Let me also remind you that you should start your corrective EQ around the busiest section of the track. But obviously, you need to check the whole track as well, because you might have different resonances that pop up in the calmer sections. This concept applies to all the steps of the mastering checklist. Always gauge the processing around the loudest part of the track, and then check the rest, making adjustments or automating things if needed. Now it's time to work on the tone. Open another EQ and use both a high shelf and a low shelf to make your track sound closer to the tone of your references. Remember that EQ goes both ways. You can boost the highs or you can cut them. You can boost the lows or you can cut them. Avoid boosting things you can't hear. If your monitoring system doesn't give you a good representation of the ultra lows, also known as subs, you shouldn't boost them. Also try to hear what happens in the mids. Your reference tracks might sound scooped around 400 or 800 Hz, and if that's the tone you're after, you can do a wide, gentle scoop there too. You may have seen mastering presets with generous boosts both for the lows and for the highs. Modern orchestral mixes, however, usually have enough lows, and a build-up of low frequency is the main enemy of loudness. So, more often than not, you'll find yourself rolling off a bit of the lows instead of boosting them. But you never know, trust the references. At this point, you might want to double check the resonances, because boosting or cutting the highs and the lows may or may not highlight new resonances or bring back some of the resonances you already treated a few moments ago. Open a third EQ if needed and do some very targeted work around those frequencies. Usually very little changes are sufficient at this point. For example, if you boosted the highs, maybe your strings now sound a little harsh, and you can fix that with targeted subtractive EQ around 6K. I can't stress enough the fact that you shouldn't boost or cut things for the sake of it, because you've seen it somewhere or because you did it last time. With a bit of practice, you'll be able to identify what needs to be done. If the sound is there already, and a few minor tweaks are required, then you just do the minor tweaks. If more significant changes are needed, then sure, do what it takes to get the tone you want. Standard compression allows you to quickly shape the transients of the whole track. You can make things snappier, or you can make things more controlled. You have to be way more subtle about it than you ever would when mixing. Use gentle ratios, keep the gain reduction low within a couple of dBs, and avoid pumping. Ultimately, it's your call if you want to push things hard, and there's definitely a place for pumping in certain types of music. However, it can make your orchestral work sound very unnatural, and it alters significantly the balances that you carefully created when you mixed. So, if your mix sounded a bit dull and lacked snappiness, something that would only happen if you compressed the sections a lot, or if you used heavily processed sample libraries, then you can bring back some of the transients with a slow attack and a relatively slow release compression. On the other hand, if your mix sounds too snappy, which is possible if you didn't compress much at the mixing stage, and now you want to make it sound a bit more controlled, you can gently tame the transients with a fast attack and fast release compression. This will also bring up the room sound a bit. If you're happy with the transient profile of your mix, there's no need for you to do anything at this stage. Getting used to hearing these subtle changes in the transient profile requires practice. Overshooting is a great exercise in this regard. You can lower the threshold a bit more and increase the ratio so that the effect becomes a lot more apparent and you know it's definitely doing what you want it to do, either controlling the transients or bringing them up. Then you can go back to appropriate levels and find a sound that you're happy with. You can also temporarily exaggerate the attack and release time. For example, if you're trying to emphasize the transients, you can start with a fast attack and slow release time, which means that you're compressing everything, and then slowly increase the attack time until you find the right spot where the correct amount of transients is coming through. You might have to move the attack time back and forth a little, but eventually you'll find the sound that you want. On the other hand, if you're trying to control the transients, you can keep a super fast attack and play with the release. You can start with a very slow release, which again means that you're compressing everything, and then shorten it progressively until you hear that it's only controlling the transients to the right degree, allowing the rest of the sound to come through. Goes without saying that your reference tracks will guide you, and once you start paying attention to these specific aspects of the tone, you'll see that some orchestral productions sound very smooth, some other productions sound snappier. It doesn't depend entirely on the compression, because the room or the reverb also have a huge impact on the transient profile. So, dry recording will sound a bit more snappy and upfront, recording with a lot of ambience will sound smoother. But this is all part of the same set of qualities that you can alter with compression at the mastering stage. Because by working on the transients, you will also affect the room component of the sound. You won't be able to take something that is very dry and turn it into something with a lot of ambience. Of course not. You won't be able to take something that has a lot of room sound and make it ultra upfront, but you'll be able to adjust things. You'll be able to take something that is upfront and make it slightly less upfront or even more upfront if it works for the track. You'll be able to take something that is smooth and make it a bit snappier if you want, or even smoother if that serves the music. These are artistic decisions that you need to make. Listen to several orchestral recordings and decide what sound you're going for. What tone suits the type of composition, arrangement, and mix that you did for the track in question. Playing with the stereo image at the mastering stage means that you can either make the track wider or narrower. We all love a wide stereo image, but if you overdo this, you'll end up pushing everything to the sides and destroy depth, turning your orchestra into a mono-dimensional thing. Classic stereo enhancers with just one band do the job sometimes. However, the low end occasionally requires extra attention. That's because an excess of stereo information in the lows can be overwhelming, and you might find that widening the sound as a whole makes your low end a little less focused. Multi-band stereo enhancers are fantastic because they allow you to work on different areas of the spectrum, making targeted adjustments. You could, for example, split the sound into two bands at around 100 to 120 Hz and only expand what's above the split line. You may even find yourself wanting to make the low end a bit more centered than it was in the mix. I am not advocating for turning the low end into mono. That's something that might work for other types of music. It's not what I would usually do to orchestral tracks, but in the end, you need to do what works for your music, and I can't overstate the importance of reference tracks in this regard. Sometimes you'll make the whole spectrum wider, sometimes you'll make it narrower, sometimes you will only expand what's above a given frequency, and sometimes you will also make the low end a bit more centered and focused than it was in the mix. You can use saturation to make things smooth, or you can use it to make things sharp. Using saturation can be as simple as picking a preset and dialing in the right amount. The point is that some people think you have to use it every time, or that you have to use the same one every time, when in fact, it really is a matter of establishing whether your track needs it in the first place, and then which type would be useful. Once you made it to this stage, you should be fairly happy with the tone of your track. At this point, if you think the sound could do with a little extra sharpness, you can pick an exciter or a saturator with a preset that adds extra brightness. Conversely, if you think the sound requires extra smoothness, you can pick a saturator with a gentle preset that increases the warmth. Clearly, if you're comparing your orchestral work to things that were recorded in the analog era, such as the old orchestral soundtracks, you might notice that the references sound really warm, and you might want to recreate that tone. Tape saturation can help with that. We're talking about subtle changes anyway, but you need to make sure that they sound intentional and that they are beneficial to the overall sound. Otherwise, in my opinion, it's better to leave things as they are. Time to worry about the volume. How does your track compare to the references? Use both integrated LUFS and your ears to make an honest comparison and establish a healthy target level for your music. There's no need to sound louder than your references. You should aim for the same volume range, which varies so much depending on the style. Listen to the soundtrack from the first Jurassic Park and compare it to something like 1,000 Ships of the Underworld by Two Steps from Hell. The volume is so different. So, the style of your composition determines the references. The references determine the desired volume. Open again your main limiter, the one you initially opened at the beginning of the whole process, and lower the threshold trying to get close to your desired volume. Don't forget to use the busiest section of the track for this. One of the following two things is going to happen. Situation A, you can achieve the desired volume with no effort. Situation B, your limiter is pumping and it destroys the sound. Situation A is more likely to happen if your target level is relatively quiet and you did everything right. It also happens easily for quiet music that doesn't necessarily feature thunderous percussion or aggressive low strings, etc. Situation B is more likely to happen for busy arrangements, epic music with tons of drums, etc. If you're unable to achieve the desired volume, 9 out of 10, it's because you have too much energy in the lows and lower mids. You could do a second round of EQ, but it's better if you use a dynamic EQ instead. This way, you can control the problematic areas in the lows and lower mids only when they hit a certain threshold. This will improve the transparency of your limiter and allow you to get more apparent volume without obvious pumping. Dynamic EQ usually come with their built-in spectrum analyzer, which helps you locate the problematic frequencies. Sometimes you have to do a few rounds of processing, a bit more corrective EQ, a bit more dynamic EQ, and then a bit more limiting, repeating the cycle a few times until the desired volume is achieved. That can happen if your references are very loud. If you don't have a dynamic EQ, you can use a multiband compressor instead. Use one or more instances of the multiband compressor to control specific areas of the spectrum without compressing the rest. I know you've seen people using multiband compressor in a different way. They still compress everything, but they use different ratios, thresholds, attack and release for each band. I don't think that's going to help you here. Instead, use it to solve specific problems and leave the other bands untouched. If you use a dynamic EQ or a multiband compressor, you should place them before the main limiter. Also a reminder that everything goes before the main limiter, apart from the 2 empty slots that I asked you to leave at the beginning of the mastering process. In some cases, you might want to add a second limiter after the main limiter. It's not something I do very often, but if you have to do a lot of gain reduction and you spread it over 2 limiters with each one doing only some of the work, you get a more transparent sound. Also, be aware that different limiters have different personalities, so if you have more than one in your arsenal, try them all and see what works best. Some limiters also have different limiting algorithms that you can choose from, and I recommend experimenting with those because they respond very differently to the audio, and picking the right one for the track you're working on can make a big difference. Your ceiling should be minus 0.3 dBs for releases. For social media, it's best to bounce at minus 1 dB at least. This varies, to be honest with you. Different social media have different compression algorithms, and sometimes the same platform has different algorithms depending on the operating system. Leaving a bit more margin is definitely a good idea. If you make a lot of content, I recommend experimenting with these things. I remember at some point I was bouncing to minus 6 dBs for safety. because the old versions of some of the platforms added their own distortion and I wanted to avoid that. If you are working on a quiet track, don't be tempted to make it super loud. It's very easy to take a track that is made of fewer instruments playing at lower dynamics and make it loud because it doesn't have all the energy in the lows and probably doesn't have sharp transients either. The thing is that if you make it too loud, all the other music in your catalog will sound small in comparison. That's even more relevant if you're working on an EP or an album that contains both quiet and busy tracks. Stick to the same monitoring level and make sure that one track flows into the next one. Make sure that the quiet tracks play at the appropriate level and that they sound good next to the loud ones without overpowering them. There is a place for volume automation in mastering. You can write volume automations if there are sections that you wish were slightly louder or quieter. You just have to be extremely subtle about it. Also, if a track has both quiet and busy sections, you don't want to make the quiet sections too loud for the same reasons that we just saw in regard to quiet tracks in an album. The last slot in your chain is for dithering. If you worked at a bit rate of 24-bit or more and now need to bounce at 16-bit, which is the standard for music releases, you need to know that there are some artifacts that occur when you reduce the bit rate of an audio file. Dithering adds a subtle noise and compensates for those artifacts. Dithering is almost inaudible in many cases, but it avoids quantization distortion, so it's highly recommended. AI mastering can help you learn how to master your music better and faster. Last time I checked, there were 2 types of AI mastering. There are websites where you can go upload your audio and it gets mastered. Then you can tweak a few parameters to make it louder or brighter, etc. That's cool, but you can't learn from it. Then you have things like the Master Assistant in Isotope Ozone, which analyzes your track, does its thing using the plugins in Isotope Ozone, and then allows you to both see and modify everything. You can learn a lot from this second type of AI mastering. It's not perfect, and the results usually require some tweaking, but it works as a second pair of ears. It can show you what you did wrong. Especially the EQ curves can be very insightful, because if your listening situation is not optimal or if you aren't experienced enough, there might be areas of the spectrum where you cut too much or didn't cut enough, and the Master Assistant can definitely point you in the right direction. So my advice is to use it as a learning tool, and then as you become more experienced, you can rely more and more on your ears, making creative and artistic mastering decisions. To summarize this module, the mastering stage is your last opportunity to check what you did when you mixed and fine-tune a few aspects if needed. Start by bringing the music to a reasonable level with a limiter. Use EQ to correct resonances and then to improve the tone of your track. Use compression to make your music more upfront or more controlled if necessary. Do a final check on the stereo image of your track and make changes if appropriate. Be aware of the possibility of using saturation to achieve more smoothness or sharpness. Use dynamic processing such as limiting and dynamic EQing to increase the volume of your music. Aim for a target level that is in line with the style of your composition.